Sometimes life doesn't shout the truth in our faces. It whispers it behind doors we never wanted to open. And when Victoria heard her father say he had secretly given $500,000 to her older sister, while ending the sentence with, "That's already enough for you," something cracked inside her. And maybe you know that feeling too, that moment when you finally realize it wasn't exaggeration, it wasn't drama, it wasn't imagination. It was family favoritism. It was the devaluation of the daughter. It was the harsh awakening of someone who grew up treated as the invisible child inside a narcissistic family. The strangest and most counterintuitive part is that the pain isn't always in the words spoken, but in what they reveal. Because when a parent decides a child's future based on comparison between siblings, hiding money, choices, and opportunities, they don't just create financial inequality, they deliver an emotional sentence. It's a form of silent emotional abuse that shapes how we breathe, think, and dream. And we grow up believing we must be practical, that we must accept crumbs while the other receives everything. But there's always a limit. There always is. And here's where the story gets even more interesting, because what destroys someone isn't the unfair family dynamic itself, but the silence they learn to swallow. Victoria stayed quiet for years, until she realized there was much more behind that sentence, much more than unequal support, much more than the secret fund set aside for her sister. There was a truth that would change everything, and it's exactly that truth you're about to uncover, the one that might make you look at your own story with new eyes. There are moments in life when the truth arrives without permission, often slipping through doors we never wanted to open. When Victoria heard her father say, "Eleanor has potential, Victoria can manage at the diner," something inside her simply stopped. It was as if all the family favoritism, all the sibling comparison, all the silent emotional abuse finally took shape. Anyone who grew up feeling like the invisible daughter understands that feeling. The world doesn't collapse all at once, it cracks quietly. And in that instant, she realized that the financial inequality wasn't accidental, it was intentional. The sentence echoed as if rehearsed for years. Until that moment, Victoria always tried justifying her parents' unequal support, wondering if she was exaggerating. But standing there, ear against the door, she realized it wasn't imagination. It was hierarchy, plain and sharp. A type of emotional sabotage disguised as being realistic, the same tactic toxic parents and narcissistic families use to keep someone in their place. It's funny how the heart understands long before the mind. She already knew, she had just never heard it out loud. That moment lit up a room inside her that had been dark for years. Suddenly, everything made sense, from the constant devaluation of the daughter to the old speech that Eleanor was the chosen one because she was born brilliant. Victoria felt the weight of years of injustice pressing against her ribs, as if that door didn't just divide rooms, but entire worlds. And while she absorbed the blow, a quiet question began to take shape, preparing the ground for what was coming next. When Victoria finally walked into the room, it felt like she carried every year of family favoritism on her shoulders. Her voice trembled, but not from fear, from clarity. And as she looked at her parents and her sister, she saw the architecture of unfairness laid out in front of her. Eleanor, the eternal golden child, delivered the final cut with that subtle smirk. "Vic, be practical." It was the same phrase that had fueled silent emotional abuse her entire life, as if Victoria's destiny was to remain invisible. Her father, without hesitation, added, "Maybe you should leave." And those words hurt not only because of what they meant, but because of how easily they were spoken. That's how emotional sabotage works in narcissistic families. The expulsion doesn't happen in a single moment, it happens slowly through crumbs of devaluation. Victoria realized she wasn't being pushed away that day. They had been pushing her out since childhood. The unequal support was finally standing exposed. As she stared at the three of them, something shifted inside her, as if the last piece of a painful puzzle had finally clicked. There was a strange clarity that only comes when sibling comparison goes too far. Victoria understood that this wasn't just a confrontation, it was the symbolic end of a lifetime spent in someone else's shadow. But as she stepped outside that house, she sensed that leaving wasn't an ending, it was the quiet beginning of something she couldn't yet name. When Victoria arrived at Aunt May's house, she felt, for the first time, a silence that comforted, not the silence that wounds. The lavender scent wrapped around her like a soft reminder that not everyone sees her as the invisible daughter. May welcomed her without questions, a simple gesture that unraveled years of family favoritism and unequal support. Narcissistic families build pressure. Wise souls like May build refuge. It's almost magical how a warm cup of tea can untangle knots that injustice tightens. It was there, at that old wooden table, that May revealed the secret fund she had been saving for Victoria since birth. A gesture so unexpected, it felt like a rebellion against every bit of silent emotional abuse Victoria had endured. While her parents invested only in the golden child, May invested in her quietly, a way to protect the daughter who had been emotionally sabotaged for years. The revelation felt like a seed planted underground, finally meeting sunlight, and for the first time, Victoria sensed she also had a future. The analogy was unavoidable. While her parents tossed crumbs, May watered roots, and roots, once they grow, can support entire forests. Victoria realized that May's support wasn't just financial, it was symbolic, emotional, almost spiritual. It wasn't just an escape from toxicity, it was proof that someone believed in her before she believed in herself. But while she absorbed this new horizon, something unexpected was already forming outside, something that would test this newfound strength. News of Lucas's arrest hit Eleanor's world like lightning. Someone raised under constant family favoritism rarely admits fragility, but life doesn't ask for permission to expose truth. Victoria watched from a distance, realizing how unfair the sibling comparison had always been. No one can maintain a fabricated perfection forever. And when the golden child's mask began to crack, the sound was louder than any silent criticism. It was like watching a tower built on financial inequality finally collapse. When Eleanor called, her voice trembled, and for the first time there was no arrogance, only fear. The plea for help pierced Victoria with a strange mix of surprise and recognition. The silent emotional abuse Eleanor herself had repeated for years now seemed powerless in the face of vulnerability. It was as if, in that call, the golden child of a narcissistic family disappeared, leaving behind a frightened young woman who finally understood the weight of unequal support. These falls aren't gentle, but they are often necessary. And the strangest part, even after a lifetime of being the invisible daughter, Victoria felt empathy, not because she forgot the emotional sabotage she endured, but because she knew what it felt like to be lost. Sometimes life levels people in unexpected ways. Eleanor, who always had everything, now needed exactly the one who had nothing. But this emotional shift between the sisters was only the beginning of a much bigger turn, one that would bring the entire family to their knees. When Victoria's parents reappeared, they didn't bring apology, reflection, or accountability. They brought a demand, one that summarized decades of favoritism and silent emotional abuse. They wanted Victoria to surrender her own inheritance to save Eleanor, as if she had always been an inexhaustible backup supply for the golden child. The irony was astonishing. The inheritance never meant for her suddenly needed to be sacrificed by her. That's how narcissistic families operate, turning the devalued daughter into obligation. But Victoria was no longer the young woman who once overheard her future being assigned to a diner. She recognized immediately a fresh attempt at emotional sabotage disguised as family unity. Her father spoke with the ease of someone who had always counted on unequal support. But inside her, a strength rooted in May's quiet love began to rise, pushing up through the concrete of financial inequality. Saying no had never felt so liberating. When Victoria finally replied, "I'm not the practical daughter anymore. I'm the daughter who decides," something shifted in the room. The silence that followed wasn't oppressive. It was the silence before a collapse. And she knew that moment wasn't the end of anything. It was only the preface. Because people who thrive on control rarely accept when the invisible child finally sees herself. What would come next wouldn't just change everything. It would expose secrets no one was prepared to face. The meeting in the lawyer's office felt like a movie, the kind no one ever wants to star in. Victoria entered alongside those who truly believed in her, while her parents walked in confident, certain they would preserve the cycle of favoritism and silent emotional abuse. They didn't expect that on that table lay years of documents, recordings, and evidence exposing emotional sabotage and even financial inequality used to uphold the golden child at the expense of the invisible one. When the first files were projected, the atmosphere shifted. For the first time, power changed hands. Her father tried to deny, then justify, then rewrite the story, the classic script of narcissistic families when confronted, but every excuse collided with undeniable evidence. Her mother cried, maybe from guilt, maybe from fear, maybe because the mask she wore for decades finally slipped. Victoria watched it all with a calmness only someone devalued their entire life can feel when finally standing tall. It wasn't revenge, it was justice, a quiet, steady justice. When Victoria demanded they leave the company and transfer control to her and Eleanor, no one dared argue. Her father cried, but it wasn't grief, it was loss of control. Her mother couldn't meet anyone's eyes. And at that moment, Victoria realized how far she'd come from that day behind the door. 5 years earlier, they broke her future. Now she rebuilt theirs, without them. And she had no idea yet that this turning point still held an even deeper reflection. In the end, Victoria's story isn't just about a father who secretly handed $500,000 to the favorite daughter. It's about something many people experience but don't know how to name: family favoritism, unequal support, that constant feeling of being the invisible daughter in a noisy home. And once we see this clearly, the question changes. It's no longer, why did this happen to me, but rather, what can I build despite it? Because no one overcomes a narcissistic family by trying to compete with those who are always favored. You overcome it by breaking the cycle inside yourself. So let me ask you honestly, where do you see yourself in this journey? Have you been carrying a devaluation that isn't yours? Have you accepted silent emotional abuse as if it were normal? Or maybe you've spent years trying to understand why you were told to be practical while everything was invested in the golden child. Take a moment and reflect. Life changes when you realize you don't have to live in anyone's shadow. You have something the past can't take from you: choice, movement, direction. And if this story touched something inside you, then here's my invitation. Don't let this reflection end here. Comment your experience, your pain, your transformation. Your voice matters, far more than a secret fund hidden in an old drawer. And of course, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Every week, there's deep human content for those who want to break cycles and build a life that finally makes sense.